Hello, my name is John, and welcome to my channel. Uh, I started this channel for a couple reasons, but the main one is that I love books, and I like to talk about them, and I'd like to talk about some of the books that I love, or that I think are interesting at least, that I haven't seen very often on YouTube or, well, pretty much anywhere else. Uh, so I really love to travel and I really love to read, and that has led to a couple of strange things about my book collection. The first is that although I prefer physical books, I prefer hard copies, actual paper, um, the overwhelming majority is the overwhelming majority of the books that I do have are unfortunately digital. I have my Kindle, oops, right here. Of course, I have a ton of books on my laptop, but I would rather have something physical. I think physical books are more beautiful, more interesting. They tell a story that you just don't get from a folder full of PDFs and Mobis and EPUBs. You know what I mean? So, the other thing is, and you may have already noticed it if you look at these lovely books behind me, although I have a fair amount, it's nowhere near as much of a bookshelf as the majority of book people on YouTube. I guess booktubers, you might say. So I want to start off by introducing myself and also introducing the books that I have physically. You can kind of use this as a you can kind of extrapolate from what I have physically, uh, some basic idea of the types of things that I would like to talk about on this channel. Now, there are going to be some things that you will notice right away that I don't have very much of in my physical shelf, and that is the standard classics, the Moby Dicks of the world, or the Scarlet Letters, or the Great Gatsby's, things like that. I love those books. Don't get me wrong, but I don't have them on my shelf. The same is true for more sort of lightweight, fun reading that I also love. So Tolkien, Pratchett, Neil Gaiman, things like that. I love those guys as well, but I don't have them on my shelf. The reason for that is very simple. Um, I could get a copy of those anywhere. You know, every bookstore around the world has Umberto Eco. Every bookstore around the world has J.R.R. Tolkien. Every bookstore around the world has William Shakespeare. What most bookstores around the world don't have is some short stories from Mongolia. As far as I know, this book was printed in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia during the communist era and never printed anywhere else. And as a result, I think it's special. And that's the kind of thing that I like to talk about, that I like to look at, I like to think about, because these are things that you can't really get anywhere else. That's why this is mostly what's on my bookshelf. So, uh, essentially, if I can find a digital copy of something, I will buy, or otherwise acquire a digital copy. Uh, and I don't really see or feel much of a need to keep a hard copy of those. So most of the books that I have, I can't find a digital copy. Uh, and I can't easily replace them. There are a few that I could easily replace in another country, that I can find a hard copy on Amazon, for example. But I live in China, so it's a little difficult to get shipping here sometimes. So anyway, we're going to start off with a quick tour of what's on my bookshelf. Uh, it is roughly divided from here to here are the books that I have both a physical copy and a digital backup. From here to here are the books that I can't find a digital backup. I only have this physical copy. And in most cases, I can't easily find a physical backup either, even if I wanted to. So these are the ones that are really special to me. But you can see that this is the majority of the shelf. So I'm going to save that for part 2, since I've already spent about 5 minutes just introducing myself. And, I don't want the video to be too long. Instead, I'm just going to talk about what we have over here for now. So, let's start things off. First book on the shelf is California: A History by Kevin Starr. Now, I am from California, so this is the history of my home state, and it's not a bad overview. I read a lot of history. I really do love it. But in general, I prefer more in-depth, deep dives instead of sort of broad overviews of history. But I have to say, I do think that broad overviews, textbooks, things like that, can be interesting and are definitely worthy of study. And it's just nice to have this. I picked this up the last time I went home to visit my family in the U.S. And I'm glad I did, because this is a really readable, approachable, broad overview history of California. And yeah, great job, Kevin Starr. I haven't read very much California history since I learned about it in school, and that's a bit of a shame. And I'm really glad that I had the opportunity to do that. So, next one. This one is my absolute favorite book of all time, Collected Fictions by Jorge Luis Borges. If you don't know Borges, you should. He was an Argentinian writer in the early 20th century, mostly in the early 20th century. He was a visionary in the truest sense of the word. Every single one of the stories in this book is a world unto itself that you can just get lost in, and it's incredible. I love Borges so much. This is actually the second copy of this book that I've had in my life. The first one was stolen from me. I don't know exactly who took it, but I had a party once and the book was gone the next day. So I had to get a new one. I actually got this in Peru, of all places, while traveling. And I'm glad I did, because this is something that I frankly never want to be apart from. I love having this book around just to dip into and read a short story here and there. It's fantastic. It's amazing. I have heard some critics say that they're not much fans of Andrew Hurley's translation. I don't know what to say to that. I like it well enough. I'm very happy with this volume. So, take that as you will. Okay, next up, we have The Collected Schizophrenias, Essays by Esme Weijun Wang. This is actually the first book that I'll be mentioning that I have not read, at least not yet. I also picked this up when I went back home the last time, the same time I picked up California: A History. And the main reason I picked it up is because I think it's really interesting to see a book about mental illness from the point of view of someone who suffers from mental illness. And I, generally speaking, I like books that tell people's stories from their own points of view. So this is definitely something that I'm looking forward to reading. In particular, I'm interested in the parts of that describes it on the back as the long journey toward a diagnosis. So I'm assuming that there's some stuff in here about living with undiagnosed mental illness, and I'm really interested in reading her perspective on that. So yeah, sounds good. Haven't read it yet. I will soon. Okay. Up next, we have Folk Elements in Burmese Buddhism by Aung. I am almost certainly mispronouncing his name, and I do apologize if you are Burmese or Myanmar people, whichever of the terms you prefer. I have quite a few books on the subject of Myanmar or Burma, and just like the books go back and forth between the two names, and frankly, a lot of English language sources nowadays go back and forth between the two names. I do too. I will sometimes switch from calling it Burma to calling it Myanmar mid sentence. And I don't mean to take a political stance by doing so. It's just kind of a habit from, you know, essentially from my media and press consumption. So, don't take offense, please. Anyway, folk elements in Burmese Buddhism. As the name implies, this covers Buddhism in Burma, but also the folk religion that predates it and has influenced it, well, since forever, basically, and continues to influence it to this day. This is a really interesting book. It's a bit outdated as a scholarly or academic source. The Looking at the copyright page, it's 1962, but the dedication page says 1959, so it's even more outdated than that. Um, but I think that outdated scholarly and academic nonfiction can still be valuable. You do sort of need to take things with a grain of salt, but I think that the the history of the ideas is in many cases just as valuable and just as interesting as the actual history of whatever the subject is that they're covering. So I love reading outdated nonfiction just as much as I like reading the most up to date current nonfiction, and I encourage people to do that. Take things with a grain of salt, but keep in mind that the history of history is in and of itself a subject that I think is worthy of study. So anyway, this one, it's really interesting. Also, just from a a physical book perspective, because this is actually a bootleg. This is copyrighted by the Oxford University Press, 1962, like I said. But I have seen Oxford University Press editions, even from back then, and none of them were even anywhere near as cheaply made as this book. This is absolutely 100% printed in a back alley in Yangon or Rangoon somewhere, and I love it for that reason. I think it's really interesting. A lot of books that I have from Southeast Asia, I think, have that kind of provenance, and it's fascinating to me. It's like almost like the old samizdat during the Soviet era. That's great, love it. So yeah, it has a story behind it. That's what I like about books. All books have a story behind them. This one has even more of a story to me. Okay, up next, we have The Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan. This is actually a borrowed book. A few months ago, before the current worldwide crisis started here in China, um, I loaned a couple of my books to a friend of mine, another foreigner living in Beijing. Uh, and in exchange, she loaned me this one. The ones that I loaned her, one of them was Frankenstein in Baghdad by Ahmed Saadawi, which, by the way, fantastic book. Almost everyone should read it, especially if you are interested in uh, folklore, the Iraq War, the original Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, an interesting new take on that story. But it's just a great book. I really recommend it. The other one was The Crocodile Fury by Beth Yahp. Uh, that was an interesting one, and I kind of regret loaning it out now because that would have been one of these that I can't get a digital backup of. I can't find it. I've seen hard copies for sale on Amazon, so if I go back to the US, I can get a new copy, but I can't find a digital backup anywhere, either through legal means or otherwise. So uh, it's kind of lost. But anyway, um, Joy Luck Club. It's pretty good. I like the story of immigration and the generation gap that exists between the older characters and the younger characters. The older characters, of course, are almost exclusively first generation immigrants from China to San Francisco, and the younger characters are their American born daughters. And I think it's really interesting to see the dynamic there, how the two generations sort of are talking past each other, uh, and they have so much trouble misunderstanding each other because they are essentially coming from different cultures. And this is interesting to me personally because I see a reflection of kind of the relationship that my mom had with her mother. My grandmother was actually born in the U.S., but her parents were immigrants from Spain, and my grandmother was very deeply connected with her Spanish roots, her Spanish culture, and Spanish was in fact her first language. But when she got married, it was to an American who did not speak Spanish. And therefore, for most of her adult life, she spoke English in the home. She never really taught Spanish or much Spanish culture to her children, my mother or my uncles. And I think that's kind of a tragedy that the way we lose touch with our culture through the process of assimilation. Um, so, but at the same time, I think, and I like, that's one of the things I like about this book, is that it shows assimilation as a process that happens, but it doesn't really like lay blame on either side for the misunderstandings. Um, it's a process, it's a situation that both people find themselves in. It's not that one person is wrong in this misunderstanding between the older generation and the younger generation. It's just that they're talking past each other, and I think that's a really interesting take on it. And yeah, it's pretty good. Okay, so now we have Latinx, the new force in American politics and culture by Ed Morales. This one I have not finished yet. I've started it, but I haven't gotten very far yet, to be quite honest. Uh, I I read a lot of history, social issues, things like that, and I'm really looking forward to getting further into this book because I do think that the story of um, Latino, Latina, Hispanic, Latinx, whatever you want to call this group of people in American politics and culture is one of the great untold dramas of American history. And yeah, I'm just really looking forward to continuing reading that one. Up next, we have Letters from Thailand by Botan. I picked this one up in Bangkok, and it's kind of a similar story as the Joy Luck Club in that it's about Chinese immigration and the culture gap between the immigrant parents and the more assimilated children. It's just that in this case, the society that the children are assimilating into is Thai society instead of American society. And that is a really interesting aspect of things that I don't think gets very much press outside of Southeast Asia. There are huge immigrant communities in places like Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, of Indonesians, or excuse me, of Chinese and Indian in particular, but people from all over Asia, all over the world, really, because there are also, of course, Western communities, Arab communities, Persian communities, um, all throughout that region. And you don't hear too much about it outside of that region, which is a shame because those communities form links both between the countries of the region and their larger, more powerful neighbors, such as China and India, as well as through diasporic connections with, for example, overseas Chinese populations in Australia, the United States, Canada, something like that. There's a reason why, for example, Crazy Rich Asians, which of course was a cultural phenomenon a couple of years ago. Uh, it didn't really take place in China. It was Chinese culturally, but not Chinese as in from China, Chinese as in from Southeast Asia. And that community, I think, is it's really interesting and really important. And so, yeah, this one, if I'm being perfectly honest, it didn't really grab me as a story, but I'm glad I've read it and I'm glad I have a copy of it because it does tell a story from a point of view that I think is really valuable. So, anyway, next up, we have Long Walk to Freedom by Nelson Mandela. This one, I don't think I need to say very much. Most people are aware of at least the broad strokes of Nelson Mandela's story, his time with the African National Congress, his his time in prison fighting against apartheid, the ultimate victory of the freedom movement in South Africa, and of course his time as president of a free South Africa. This one is important to me as a physical copy because it was a gift from a South African friend of mine. So it was actually brought from South Africa itself. And that makes it kind of special, even though it is just a used paperback copy. I'm still really pleased with it. And like I said, it has a story. And I think books that have stories are important to me. So yeah, it's good. And of course, the book itself is great too. Don't get me wrong. I don't mean to pay short shrift to Nelson Mandela as a writer. He was a fantastic writer. Up next, we have The Malay Archipelago by Alfred Russel Wallace, Penguin Classic Edition. I really like Penguin Classics editions, although I have to say I'm not a big fan of the orange covers. I prefer the black covers, but not important. What makes this book important is that, well, for one thing, Alfred Russel Wallace was an incredible scientist. He was a contemporary of Charles Darwin, and he worked out the theory of natural selection more or less at the same time as Charles Darwin. The two of them were in contact with each other, so it's possible there might have been some sharing of ideas back and forth, but basically the two scientists pretty much came up with the same idea at the same time independently. And that's really amazing. And of course, Darwin published first, so he's the one that gets the credit, but Alfred Russel Wallace deserves just as much credit, I think. This book in particular is a travelogue of his time traveling in what nowadays you would call Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and East Timor, or Timor-Leste, or Timor-Leste, depending on how you prefer to anglicize it. And it's really great if you can get past the Victorianness of it. This is a very Victorian English book, and as such, it is a very colonialist book. So, from a modern point of view, from my point of view, it's difficult to read at times. There's a whole chapter about praising the Dutch colonial system in Java and talking about how it's a model for British colonialism in Malaya and elsewhere. There's a whole chapter on uh, well, there's a whole chapter where he basically just wanders around the forest in Borneo shooting orangutans. And these kinds of things are really difficult to read from a modern point of view. But if you can get past that, you can see the incredibly perceptive mind that Alfred Russel Wallace had. Uh, he cared deeply about basically all aspects of life in the region, the humans, the animals, the plants, everything. He was a great naturalist, and you know, he had his flaws, of course, but who doesn't? So it's a good book if you can get past that. Speaking of colonialism, we have Multatuli, or excuse me, Max Havelaar by Multatuli. Multatuli was he was a Dutch author. It was a pen name. That his real name was, let me see, Edward Duves Dekker. I'm almost certainly mispronouncing that one as well. I apologize, Dutch people. I'm sorry. Uh, so Max Havelaar, it was almost a memoir, you could say. Multatuli was a Dutch colonial administrator in Java, and after his time serving there, he went back and wrote this as an expose of the terrible situation, the terrible treatment of the native people by the Dutch authorities. So you could almost say that this is like the antidote to Alfred Russel Wallace's praising of the Dutch authorities. My understanding is that this was very, very controversial in the Netherlands at the time it was published. Nowadays, it's kind of regarded as a classic of Dutch literature, but doesn't get a whole lot of attention outside of the Netherlands, which is a shame. It's a great book. Of course, I have it in English translation. I can't read Dutch, but yeah, it's good. It deserves to be more widely read. Um, for yeah, for several reasons, both because it's a good book and because it's always interesting to see people's accounts of the colonial era who had firsthand experience with it. Um, I read a lot about the colonial era, both from the point of view of the colonists, from the point of view of the colonizers, and also from modern points of view retrospectively. Um, I think it cannot be stressed enough that the foundation of the modern world was laid in the colonial era. So, as terrible as that era was, as much human suffering as there was in that era, we cannot understand the modern world without looking back at it and taking an assessment of it. So, yeah, Multatuli is a good. Okay, speaking of colonialism again, and just to show that it's not just in the distant past, this is The Prince of the Marshes and Other Occupational Hazards of the Year in Iraq by Rory Stewart. Rory Stewart, he was at the time in 2003, he was appointed the deputy governor of the Amara and later Nasiriyah provinces of Iraq uh, under the Coalition Provisional Authority. And this book is basically his memoir of that time. He he does a remarkable job of humanizing both the people involved in the occupation and the Iraqi people, um, and that's kind of a difficult thing to do. Especially, if you're being shot at, trying to humanize the people shooting at you it's challenging, I'm sure. So I have to give him credit for that. Um, as with any memoir, you have to take it with a grain of salt because he is telling his side of the story. But I think this is going to be a really important book in the future in terms of our understanding of the history of the Iraq War, the occupation, the sequence of events that have led to where we are now in the Middle East, things like that. And yeah, and it's well written too, of course. Honestly, I like The Places in Between, his other famous book, a little bit better than this one. I think it's a more interesting, better written book. But I think this is ultimately going to be a more historically important book. So next up, we have The River of Lost Footsteps, Histories of Burma by Thant Myint Oo. Again, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing his name. This one it is a broad strokes history of Myanmar from the pre-colonial era, but like late pre-colonial era up to now. And in those terms, it's successful. But what really makes it special is that Thant Myint Oo kind of tells that story through his own perspective and his own family's perspective. So it never really reads like a textbook. It reads more personally, and it's a really good history book. I do have to say, again, just like my other book on Burma, this one is also a bootleg that was probably printed in the back streets of Yangon, or excuse me, Yangon. And the reason I know that is because this particular copy is at times almost unreadable because the quality of the paper and ink is so bad. Let me see if I can find an example. Uh, oh, well, yeah, here we are. Okay. So you can kind of see there how the opposite side is bleeding over so much that it's actually hard to read the page. So this one I'm really thankful that I have a digital copy of, because although I like having this book for the story behind it, that it is a bootleg copy that was actually printed in Myanmar, um, I'm also glad that I have a copy that I can genuinely read. So that's definitely a benefit. Okay. Up next, we have Russian Magic Tales from Pushkin to Platonov. This one I think is great for me because I do think that things like fairy tales, ghost stories, folklore, it's really important. People don't think they're important, but they influence the way that we think about the world. And it's one of my kind of core beliefs that the way people think about the world is almost more important than the way the world actually is, because the way people think about the world influences how they react to the world. So that's why, even though I myself am not religious, I love reading about religion, mythology, folklore, these kinds of things, because even if they might not be literally true, they have so much influence on the world as it is, and you simply cannot possibly understand humanity, history, modern politics without also understanding where people got these ideas and where people got this way of thinking. So this one here, it's Russian magic tales. So it's folklore influenced short stories from Russia, starting in I believe 1799 is the earliest one, and going up to the Soviet era. And that's one of the things that I think is really interesting about this too, is that in a very materialist society like the Soviet Union, they still had these magic stories that people might say, oh no, I don't believe that, but they still told the stories. And I think that's really interesting that it can still have that kind of impact and influence on people's thinking. So next one, we have selections from the Carmina Burana. You may be more familiar with Carmina Burana from the modern classical composition by Karl Orff, but this is the medieval secular Latin songs that inspired that composition. And one thing that I really like about this is that there's kind of an informality to it. A lot of these are things like drinking songs or love poetry that we don't have a lot of from the Middle Ages. And it's good to see what real people were thinking of and talking about and doing and believing at that time, because we don't get that a lot. Much of the text that we have from the Middle Ages is a lot more formal. Religious treatises, hagiographies, things like that. And a lot of what we think we know about the Middle Ages is more about how they were interpreted by 18th, 19th, and early 20th century authors. And as I said, regarding fairy tales, that's important too. The history of ideas is important, but it's nice to get some actual source material that kind of gives us an idea of what people were really thinking about back then. So, next up, we have Strange Tales from a Chinese Studio by Pu Song Ling. This one is, again, kind of a folktale related, not exactly folktales, because these were fiction that was actually composed by a single author, but it's related to Chinese folklore. Most of the stories here are either ghost stories or fox spirit stories. There are fox spirits in a lot of East Asian folklore. You find them in China, in Korea, famously in Japan. And in both the cases of the ghost stories and the cases of the fox spirit stories, more often than not, what happens in the story here is a man falls in love with a beautiful woman, and it turns out that she's a fox or a ghost. She tries to seduce him, and either she succeeds and he dies, or she fails and he escapes. One or the other. So you can kind of get from that summary that there's a lot of really interesting sexual politics going on in here, or that can be read into it at least. I don't really mean to say that it's actually in going on, but you can certainly read into it. Because almost always what you have, the dynamic is a predatory female and innocent victim male. And that has a little bit of an implication, you know what I mean? But nevertheless, the stories are almost universally quite charming. They're well told, well written, really interesting stuff. Um, One criticism that I have is that this particular volume, I know for a fact, is very abridged. I would like to have, I'd like to have a volume that was a bit more substantial as far as Pusong Ling goes. But for what it is, this is a good introduction. I'm happy with it. Yeah, it's definitely recommended. Okay. And finally, we have Where China Meets India, Burma and the New Crossroads of Asia by Thant Mien U, same author as The River of Lost Footsteps. And just like that one, this is a really interesting kind of history of Myanmar, both broad strokes and more personal. And this one is a bit more modern because it does deal a lot with globalization and the relationship that Myanmar has in the modern era with China, India, and other international players. I think that Myanmar is going to be a very important country in the future because of its location, because it does play this role as a bridge between China, India, Southeast Asia. And as it becomes more important, as those connections are developed, it's going to be interesting to see how things go. And I think it's very possible that this will wind up being a very important book as well. So anyway, I think that's going to be it for this video. As that's all of the books on my shelf that I have digital backups of. The rest of them are the ones that are really special to me that I don't have a digital backup of, but I'm already at 40 minutes. I don't really want to go any further with this one. So that's going to have to be part two. So thank you very much for watching my first video. Hopefully there will be many more to come. And stay tuned for part two, where we go over the books that I do not have a digital backup of. So thank you. Bye.